Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute privilege for me on behalf of the Center for Policy Research to welcome all of you to this wonderfully important book discussion. The Brand New Nation, Capitalist Dreams and Nationalist Designs by Dr. Ravinder Kaur. It's a real pleasure and privilege for us to have you here at the CPR platform. As many of us were saying just before we formally started, so many of us have encountered your work and been wanting to engage in a deeper conversation with you. And we've been excitedly awaiting the publication of your book. So it's really a long-held ambition to have you on the CPR platform. And I'm really pleased that Priyadarshini was able to pull this together and the book became the sort of glue that brought us all together. And really looking forward to the discussion. We have, along with Dr. Ravinder Kaur, to discuss her book, two really wonderful guests. But before that, we also have CPR's own Mekhala Krishnamurthy, who will offer some introductory remarks before we start the conversation. Mekhala heads CPR's State Capacity Initiative. Again, our pre-conference chatter or pre-formally launching the conversation chatter, we were talking about how actually central questions of how ideas of nationhood and identity are actually built through the state itself, and how central state capacity actually is to this discourse too. I very often think of state capacity as technical capabilities that public institutions that make up the state hold, but the norms, the cultures, the belief systems that these technical capabilities actually bring together, and the ways in which they articulate an imagination of the nation and understanding of what it means to be Indian, and how this then gets projected across the globe is actually as much, if not more, about the capacity and capabilities. And I know that Mekhala is going to talk about this a little bit also in her remarks. To discuss the book, we have with us Professor Swagoto Sarkar and Professor Ajay sorry, I'm now going to pronounce this all wrong. So Professor Ajay, if you don't mind, I will request you to excuse me on my bad pronunciation with your last name. But a really very warm welcome to both of you to the CPR platform. Dr. Kaur, as I was looking through your book, I was very much reminded of a conference I had attended in the late 2000s when it was a global conference. Lots of members of the Indian state were present, as well as lots of Indian private capital was present. It was an exciting moment because Indian capital really did feel that it had arrived on the global stage. India was in the height of its high growth phase. And in the midst of all of this, a lot of the conversation was about this idea of jugaad and how relevant jugaad is to telling us the story of India and the story of new India, that we are a nation that is so innovative and inventive that we make business out of adversity, we make business out of, and this is something to be celebrated. And I was so deeply puzzled by this because we, used to use the word jugaad as a, everything is just jugaadu. You manage to take Fevicol and stick two broken pieces of stick together and say, that's the table I'm going to work on. It's actually a sign of something that's deeply broken that we were trying to make do and work with, rather than something that rather than something that was to be celebrated. In fact, in sort of common parlance, or at least how I understood jugaad was something that would allow you to get by, not something that demonstrated capability, power, capacity. And so much about your hypothesis sort of just as I was, it sort of really brought back memories of how puzzled I was in this conference, and how much this was part of both the state and capital coming together to project itself in a certain way and build that narrative. And it's so visible in everything that you talk about. And of course, over these last few years, especially as we've tried to make make sense of the many changes that India is continuing to go through, and all that this means for the kind of society we are becoming, for the kind of politics that we are that is emerging and evolving. I think we've all been trying to struggle with making sense of this, and your book is such an important contribution into helping us understand this, and also taking us away from the very black and white sort of polarized public discourse that we have, even in attempts at trying to make sense of this. So really looking forward to hearing about your book, and also particularly looking forward to hearing the comments from our wonderful panelists, Dr. Professor Swagoto Sarkar and Dr. Ajay, and of course, Mekhala. Thanks again, and Mekhala, over to you.
Thanks so much, Yamini. I know we're really looking forward to this conversation, so I will add a very brief welcome, and on behalf of the State Capacity Initiative, which Priyadarshini is a colleague, and her work has been very important to us precisely for the reason Yamini sort of pointed out, that when you think about state capacity, even when we have an initiative called the State Capacity Initiative, we tend to not only think about it as technical and capacity building as somehow a fairly neutral, wholesome activity, but evacuate it of both a certain kind of normative content and a politics, right? And so for us at the State Capacity Initiative, I think building on the tradition that CPR has, we want to think and look at state capacity and the questions of the state with the normative questions of our times front and center. So that includes looking at and thinking about, the social contract, right, and state power, thinking about democracy and federalism as central to any conversation that we might have about state capability. And within that, therefore, very essentially, you cannot separate the ideas of the nation, nationalism, the affective and practical worlds and lives and relations between the nation and the state as it is evolving in contemporary India. So for us, that's one critical reason why this book is so important and exciting, and part of a series of discussions and work that we wish to build on, which is really thinking deeply, both in historical context, sociologically, and with political economy, about the relationship between nation and state. So, the second reason it's actually really exciting to have you here is precisely because I think in this book, Ravinder Kaur, really you take on this question about bureaucratic work in a very interesting way. And again, here we talk about, the bureaucracy, and it's a national project, but the work of shaping a brand is as a bureaucratic exercise and requiring bureaucratic capacity. This is something that, of course, has got a lot of attention in recent times, because we're talking about social media, public communication, the reshaping of the narrative of how the Indian state reaches out both to citizens and more, globally, and the fashioning of India, brand equity, the commodification and commoditization of the nation is in part at least bureaucratic work. And so it's really interesting to think about the kinds of structures that has enabled, and how bureaucracy, which is something, of course, that the State Capacity Initiative we focus on very centrally, trying to understand Indian bureaucracy, its changing norms, its practices, cultures, as well as sort of the various institutional arrangements that shape it. So I think you bring a very interesting question to us when you think about what does it mean for bureaucratic work and our understanding of what bureaucrats do, the fashioning of this brand. So that's the second thing. And third, and I think this is something I'm sure you, but also our panelists who have been steeped in thinking about Indian political economy will take up, is the question of state capacity and the economy, right? So that there's a fundamental way in which public institutions participate in the life of both what constitutes the Indian economy and in how you govern and think about the Indian economy, both the notion of public investment, regulation, regulatory capacity, the kinds of moves and maneuvers, the relationship between state and capital through these institutions, but also the relationship between a whole range of other kinds of economic associational forms that are also tied up in the project of the nation in often very contradictory ways. So understanding the state, its capacities, public institutions, their capacities in shaping sort of the economy, but also in shaping a whole range of non-state actors that are absolutely tied into the politics of national nation building, and how that is working itself out is really important to us. So thinking about regulatory and associational life in that context. So I think your book really throws us in many different directions. It's a wonderful privilege and honor to have you here, and really looking forward to the conversation. I'll hand it over to Priyadarshini and then we can get started.
Thank you, Mekhala and Yamini. Without taking too much time, very, very quick and basic introduction of our discussants today. I'd also like to congratulate Dr. Kaur. The Brand New Nation is part of the Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay Long List Prize for 2021. So really looking forward to the discussion. Our discussants today, Professor Swagoto Sarkar is a professor and founding faculty member of Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, and Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy, who's Associate Professor, Center for Political Studies, JNU. Our discussants have written extensively on political economy of governance, social movements, and elite and non-elite forms of political mobilization. I'm really hoping that our discussion today lends itself to global conversations around the remaking of the nation and of nationalism as a source of cultural and political identity in face of a capitalistic globalized world order. So over to you, Ravinder.
Okay, I have to first of all begin by really thanking you for having me over. I mean, when I received your mail, I was truly excited in the way you had described the project, the State Capacity Initiative at CPR. So I'm really thankful that after years of working on my book all by myself, that I'm able to engage with this distinguished panel of scholars. So thank you so much for having me over. So I think what I'm going to do is to, first of all, I will try and put on screen share. Is this visible?
Yes, it is.
Sure. So I think I have 2 or 3 points that I would like to make, and after which it's basically an outline, some of the key arguments which I discuss in my book, but also to do with the contemporary politics which is unfolding in India. So I think I'll begin by opening with this image. Now, this image is, it simply says open for business. And it's a sign that we are all very familiar with. It's something which is put on outside shops, business establishments, whether they are open or closed for business. But if you pay attention to it, then at the bottom, it says www.incredibleindia.org. So this poster is from 2002. And this is part of the Incredible India series, which was launched by the government of India. So the questions that I'm asking basically in this, my research is that what does it mean to hang this kind of sign, open for business, on a nation state? And in this case, a nation state called India. So the main questions that I'm addressing is that when and how did India become an emerging market, or rather an investment destination for the global capital? And what does it even mean for a nation to be imagined as a market? And more importantly, what kind of politics has shaped and been shaped in return by the capitalization of the nation state? So these are some of the questions that I am going to deal with. So one quick comment about what identity economy is all about. So what I'm talking about, what I want to bring on the table is the unlikely alliance between culture and capital, or taking cultural politics not as a sideshow to the domain of economy, but addressing the close alignments between identity politics and capitalist economy. So what I'm looking at is a counterintuitive disclosure of how cultural identity in its commodified form is deployed to capitalize the nation, and in return, the potential capital gains are put to work to reconfigure the nation into a unified cultural entity. So my endeavor is to bring two things which are usually separated in political analysis, cultural politics and economy, together. And this, I believe, is tremendously important in making sense of how India is developing at the moment, where there is a strong surge of Hindu nationalism on one hand, and at the same time, the capitalist transformation continues unabated, as we will discuss. One more thing that I would like to put on the table already is that, that we need to reconsider images as data. When we use the word data, we often end up thinking about statistics, numbers, graphs, charts. But images like these and many more that I'm going to show you, they are often dismissed as something flimsy, something not worthy of our attention. They are even, I think, many conferences that I have, when I was doing my research, when I presented this, often I met with this comment that this is sort of government propaganda. Why should we pay attention? So I think what I have done in my work is precisely to take seriously the images which are produced by the state and to take the vision which is presented not as a fact, but rather as the drawing board of the future, thinking of the future. And futures, when I use this term, it is both as indicative of the time to come, but also of commodification, the financial markets. So this is the elite vision of the nation of not how it is, but how hopefully it will be. And it will be through the route of capitalist transformation. So images are a form of data which are often discarded, and it is that discarded data, archive, that I'm picking up, among other sources. So I think what I'm going to do is to take you back to the 1990s, a moment which many of us have lived through. So the early 1990s was a moment of fragile hope and anxiety. The nation had just opened up its economy to join the world of free markets, a post-Cold War, end of history world of global free markets. The formula proved seductive. It held out the promise of foreign investments, high economic growth, and of unleashing the cage spirit of Indian enterprise. It also promised more consumer choices to Indian citizens, dreams of a better life, and most of all, a chance to set the nation's course to resplendent 21st century futures. The forward march to market liberalization entailed a break away from India's old legacy of economic nationalism too. That is, India's anti-colonial economics of Swadeshi, literally of one's own nation or self-reliance. Swadeshi had dominated Indian economic policy and thinking since national independence, and it prioritized autonomy over the nation's resources. The boycott of foreign-made goods was the most popular expression of Swadeshi politics. But in the 1990s, the Swadeshi began to be upended, even seen as a vestige of the past, holding back India from economic prosperity. So new Indian economic policy in 1990s threw open the consumer market to foreign goods. Swadeshi school of economic thinkers termed it as the Coca-colonization of India. Coca-Cola, in this dramatic transition to free market capitalism, at once became a sign of worldly pleasures now available to Indian consumers, as well as the treachery of selling out to foreign corporations. Recall that in 1977, Coca-Cola had been banned by the Indian state. The company was subsequently turned into a nationalist venture that sold an Indian brand of soft drinks. A quarter of a century later, Coca-Cola was not only back in the newly liberalized India, it had also bought the Indian brand to expand its operations in the market. The corporate sale of the Indian soft drinks brand to Coca-Cola was an illustration of how the logic of liberalization and globalization had displaced the principles of Swadeshi economic nationalism. The free market lobby, as it was called, remarked ruefully that the government had sold out to big business and sullied India's anti-colonial dream of economic independence. Though the advocates of Swadeshi and socialists contested liberalization in the 1990s, few had grasped the full consequences of India's transition to free market capitalism. At this point, that is early 1990s, the socialist and Swadeshi resistance aimed to prevent the opening of Indian consumer market to foreign goods or the foreign takeover of Indian companies. Yet, liberalization of India proved more than the question of consumer goods or companies. The nation state in the 21st century global economy was itself undergoing a capitalist transformation into a lucrative commodity that is becoming an enclosure of global capital. Already in the 1990s, India had begun courting foreign capital to rejuvenate its economy through global investment programs. What initially began as a push to sell made in India goods in global markets would soon turn into a Make in India project that sought to reconfigure India as a veritable factory of the world for global manufacturing. At the turn of the millennium, a historic publicity campaign called India Shining launched India as an investment hotspot in the global markets. The mediatized projection of India disclosed the inner workings of how India was being reorganized as a market. The campaign name, India Shining, was more than just publicist hyperbole. It was an accurate description of post-colonial India's transition to capitalism. The shining metaphor promised India's great transformation into a brand new nation, that is a refuge for global capital made available through state-led programs. I would like you to please look at these images. These images are produced by the government of India. As you can see, this is part of the India Shining campaign, and it is the uplifting language of markets. And here is an image that I'm showing you, which was actually not published, but it is actually the most telling image because this image brings back Columbus, as you can see. It does not name India, but it is, as you can see, it says, the last time we held so much promise, Columbus discovered America. And if you continue reading, it is literally an allusion to what Columbus missed out on once upon a time. But now here's an opportunity for you to come back. And this time you do not need to get lost in the ocean because here there is a navigation being provided. Please come because our GDP is closer to 7% this year. Every sector is radiant, infrastructure is keeping pace and so on and so forth. Our country is shining and you have never had a better time to shine together. This you will remember. So I think this is amazing image, which basically this time it is the government of India which is making an invitation to foreign investors. So it's completely upside down imagery that we are looking at. So the infusion of capital made India shine in the theater of world economy, a luster kept alive by profits the investors hope to generate. It entailed too a transformation of the nation into a fully capitalized income generating asset, or in the language of policy experts, structural adjustments and lowering of trade barriers, all aided and abetted by global financial institutions and facilitated by the state. Now, this move altered the old compact between the nation and the state. Once structurally adjusted, the nation became a site of production, its territory a reserve of untapped natural resources, its population a demographic dividend that both produced and consumed, and its culture a unique brand identity. The great state power rearranged the nation as a market-ready investment destination. The glue that bound the nation and the state together was the optimistic vision of economic growth and prosperity, the erasure of the colonial shame, and even restoration of a mythical golden past, a Hindu past. The past decade or so, the Indian nation brand identity, as we see, has increasingly foregrounded an ancient Hindu past to fashion a unique cultural identity in the global economy. So what began as a soft power push to overhaul India's image in the world in 1990s eventually became an instrument to strengthen the Hindu nationalist claims to represent the authentic pre-Muslim spirit of the nation. Now, I just want you to just look at these images. One point I would like you to pay attention, that often the story of globalization in India is told of a force which came from outside and into and overpowered. And of course, what we see here is both a push and a pull. This is something which takes place gradually. And what you can see in this imagery is that India is being reimagined in the world also as a market, a profitable market where investors should be going into. And this, for example, is constantly a push to get India to do further reforms. And this, of course, is the making of the enclosure of capital, where the logic of capital or growth becomes very central to the imagination of the nation. And this picture is from Davos at the World Economic Forum, where I have done fieldwork during the annual meeting. This is the India Pavilion, where the Indian capitalists basically are positioned as not just as wealth creators, but also as nationalists who are doing the very best for the nation. And often the language they use is of anti-colonialism, namely this time by upturning the entire logic by going out and buying foreign companies. So here I come to the question of identity making, which is so important in this moment. So the ongoing transformation of the nation state provides yet another counterexample to the enduring myth of the extinction of the nation state in the flat world of free markets. Proponents long imagined globalization, shorthand for unrestrained mobility of capital, goods, people, and ideas, as a world in motion. But yet, what we witness over here is that within this euphoria of globalization, the nation state had not only defied the predictions of its end, but it was undergoing a spectacular makeover to become a capitalist growth story in the global economy. The nation state in its commodity form was maintaining its role as a key actor, despite predictions of its retirement. So here I'm going to show you some of the images that you will all be familiar with, namely the making, these are campaigns called India Shining, which have been forgotten and, by the way, erased. You will not find these images anymore in the public domain, except in books or research articles. So here you can see the making of a new identity of an India which is prosperous, which is a market economy, and of course it's also a progressive place. As you can see, this is almost like the poetry of economy, because when economists speak about economic matters, of course they speak in terms of, as I said, statistics, graphs, charts, but these images brought out that logic of growth into the popular domain by imagining how India and Indians could be. And here is the famous cricket mom, who is so happy that even when she loses the wicket, that she's cheerful. And this is because expenses are settling, budgets are balancing, mothers are smiling. You have never had a better time to shine together. Here I will show you images of incredible India. Please pay attention to a few of them. Also pay attention to how I in India is replaced by the exclamation mark, which became a kind of logo of this new market entity called Brand India. When we speak about identity, we also speak about the making, reimagining the global Indian. An Indian, I was told, who also has the ability to poke fun on them, on themselves. So here you can see not all Indians are polite, hospitable, and vegetarian. And of course, these all date from the early 2000s. And India was a very different place at that time. Here, there are more, the linkages which are being made between the natural landscape, territory, and identity. So in a way, we are looking at the old 19th and 20th century form of nationalism where the territory is being reclaimed and reinstituted within the national imagination. But as I said, this time, it is the market form of the nation which continues to take precedence. Now I will come to some of the images, and a very important point in this imagery of not just what is in the visual frame, but also what has been consistently left out. Image making project is always, it is an elite project. So what is in the image, of course, decides what kind of predominant identity there is going to be. But at the same time, what is equally noteworthy is what is left out of those images. So here I'm showing you this image, which is one of the few images, actually, of the probably only 2 images within the Incredible India campaign, which was long running, and it has hundreds of images in it. In that catalog of New India, there are very few images like this. This is Taj Mahal, as you can see, turned upside down. It's a beautiful imagery. But of the Muslim monuments from Islamic, Indo-Islamic architecture, this would be one of the examples. And mostly it is the imagery like this that has been promoted quite a lot. The conflation between India and Hindu identity has continued to take place over and over again. And this is, of course, the logic of how the cultural, India as a unified cultural entity has been manufactured alongside the making of India as a capitalist nation. So here I wanted to show you that, of course, it was not always like this. There were a lot of differences between in the second decade of 21st century and the first decade. And here you can see that India's shining imagery, yes, it did have images of minorities. I mean, in this case, a Muslim entrepreneur. And what it shows is, yes, everyone had a place in the nation, but through the market route. If you could invest, if you could consume, manufacture, contribute to the economy, there was a route for you to belong to India too. So here you see, I make my India shine by taking charge of my future. I join hands with India's prosperity by starting a small scale unit and so on and so. And the last lines, I make my India shine, I am India shining. So this is again an example of the capitalist shift and how you recreate a relationship with the nation through the market route. And I'm saying all this because we all can see the stark differences which have taken place over the years. This is another imagery where the idea of the nation as a multicultural, secular place where religious extremism is seen as something problematic is also reflected in a series of imagery which was produced, this time by Times of India, by the way. This is not government work. So Times of India is the only agency in that sense which is non-government. I have a whole chapter on it, that why Times of India got involved in something so massive as in a way, nation branding. And part of the reason is that, of course, for Times of India, the readership base is literally that expanding middle class, which really was becoming too anxious, that it wanted the economic growth logic had been taken to heart. So it is that urban middle class readership who also happen to be, the voting population, which usually would not vote, but got involved in politics, which of course leads to the Aam Aadmi movement, India Against Corruption. We all know the story, it is all very recent, that these are the building blocks. The point here is that the outcome that we are witnessing right now, the history, it is not predetermined. It did not have to turn out this way. What we are witnessing here is that it could have gone in many different directions. And here you can see the remains of the old, multicultural, secular notion of the nation, which is in alignment with the market economy. So finally, I'm coming to the present moment, which is the monetization. So this is a familiar image produced again by Economic Times, and this is only very recently that this announcement has been made. And for those of us who have been following the developments in political economy, this was not completely a surprise that the rush for, or the push for, to monetize the nation or assets of the nation, it totally works with that logic of reimagining the nation as a reservoir, as a repository of natural resources, which must be capitalized. So I think in a way, the shock, if there was, it was more about the scale of things, because I think already through 1990s and on, the push to privatize has been there, and public-private partnerships have, in many places, in many different government agencies, they have become a norm. So I think what was amazing or surprising was the scale of this monetization which was taking place. We must also note that often this is a tricky thing, because the logic, I think everyone immediately buys, that these are just assets which need to be capitalized and they will bring revenue. But what we do know about public-private partnerships also is that often it is the public which ends up paying for the private players. So this is, in terms of an economic bargain, it does not make sense at all. But what is important is that this economic growth logic here is made visible for all of us, that first of all, the main infrastructures of the nation are put on offer in the market. So I think I am sort of going to wrap up over here with last comments. So if this is the nation form that we are witnessing in the 21st century, then what does it mean to love the nation? I think one, and this is an important thing, because we think about the nation, in the 19th and 20th century logic, where we are all supposed to love the nation in terms of sacrifice, etc. But I think what we are witnessing here is that to love the nation means to consistently enhance its economic value, to enhance its image in the world. And this is such a strong logic which can be witnessed all the time, every day. And this, I think during the pandemic, there was a call to speak about the nation in positive terms. Like we were all asked to share our positive stories, and which, as we all know, is somewhat of a dichotomy, in the sense that this basically means overlooking your own suffering and the suffering that may be going around you. And this is where we see that the pact of a democratic nation as a capitalized entity, as a brand, which also means that dissent is not seen as a favorable thing. It is almost seen, I mean, when we get surprised that how do we begin speaking about dissenters as traitors, or think about sedition. This is where the logic of the brand as an enclosure of capital, but also as a unified cultural entity, which must be governed tightly and kept in check all the time, has to be kept in mind. So I think there is the last, perhaps I can talk about is the farmers' movement, which has been going on. During the pandemic, what we have witnessed is the reinforcement of the capitalist logic, where more and more sectors of the economy are being opened up for private players, of which monetization pipeline program is also an example. But at the same time, the rhetoric, the cultural political rhetoric becomes stronger. So I think I will stop here.
Thank you, Ravinder. Thank you for a very long and I would say nuanced trip down memory lane, right down from 1990s onwards to the 2000s. I would now like to invite our discussants to reflect on Dr. Kaur's presentation. I would also request the participants that if they have any questions or reflections, please post them in the Q&A box. After we've had comments from Professor Sarkar and Dr. Gudavarthy, we will take comments as they come along. So over to you, Professor Sarkar.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Priyadarshini, for inviting me. And I just realized that I have known Ravinder for almost 14 years now. And 2007 is when I was a visiting student. I was doing a PhD and was a visiting student at Roskilde, and where Ravinder was based. And the work that you see today was something that she was initiating into at that time. She was thinking about it, and there were those initial presentations which she made. And it's nice to see that it has finally come out in book. And more importantly, it's now available in India. And so it has already won prizes. And as Priyadarshini mentioned, she's already on the various long lists. And we hope that it gets the prize that it deserves. So having said that, let me, in my understanding that when India was projected on globally as the new destination, it was always in conjunction with China. And the difference that Indians made, the images that Ravinder has shown us, is India's claim as an old ancient civilization making its comeback or a claim on the world, not being an empire. With China, a claim on the world was both civilization and an empire, whereas Indian had no such imperial ambitions. And the way India was projected at that time was primarily as a market, as Ravinder said, and a market which has consumers, which is untapped and which has a vast possibility of creating a consumer class. Now, if you compare that with China, China was projecting itself as the factory of the world with a skilled labor and infrastructure. India had none of that. So India in that way was already playing a second fiddle, acknowledging perhaps its own limitations and what it was trying to do. But I'm not going to focus so much on that. I'm going to look at it from what I do which is the politics of development. And from that perspective, nationalism is important and interesting because I see it as a force which has a certain way of mobilizing people, in constructing the people in a particular way. It is the mechanism for consent seeking in the domestic politics. Plus, it creates certain lines of exclusion, both of certain groups and communities and ideas. And then what are the legitimate demands and claims that one can make, and what are the punitive actions that will be, where the excluded will be subjected to. And I think that's an important force, because that force is then used into the kind of capitalist transformation which one wants. And this is not the old style Nehru and post-Nehruvian capitalist transition, where the state was at the focus, and through the Green Revolution and etc., where you co-opt the elite into and provide them state assistance and bring the technological deficiencies which might exist in the society, and you supplement that or sometimes complement that through the state intervention, and thereby you bring certain kind of transition and the externalities of that would be the change in social relationship. Here, after liberalization, it was basically reconstructing the relationship between the state and capital. And there, I think the important thing of nationalism, one is that force, how it reorganizes that field and allow the space for the capital to accumulate and expand. The other part of that, and that's where the governance literature, state capacity literature will come in, into the how nationalism is used to frame certain issues as problems, and for which a certain set of solutions one goes about finding those. And the other part is that any nationalism as an ideology will have a set of vision and how those gets translated into policies and projects. And what we have seen, the liberalization during this phase is to create a certain discursive move, space where the state and capital starts conversing into a certain common linguistic terms, so that it becomes of a new language through which this conversation can take place. What I find interesting about India at that point, whether you take Indira Gandhi as the starting point of liberalization or the Narasimha Rao as the starting, Manmohan Singh as the starting point, in both of that you see India always had this problem of a certain mechanism for government formation, which is winning the election and forming the government through whether through the simple majority or through the coalitions, and then governing the country. And there was always a disjuncture between the two. There are attempts, say in the 70s with Indira Gandhi trying to bring Garibi Hatao, and that becoming the focus of the government. Rest from the 80s onwards, when she comes back, these two are separated. These two processes are separated, though development becomes at the part of that government formation process. And that's why you see the reform by stealth, which Rob Jenkins talks about, that reform didn't have legitimacy. This is not something which is taken through the electoral process. And therefore, India had to depend on the executive branch to carry forward this various sorts of liberalization. Liberalization for me around that time from 1990 to 2003 was relatively, one might say, easier, because what was happening then was a pre-packaged structural adjustment which India implemented in an unorthodox fashion. Unlike the African countries which was dictated, India was in a much better form to selectively take from that and then expand. And the moment the baselines were lower, so the moment India started opening, we saw the growth coming in, and that created. The 90s was basically therefore more about the social impact that it had, creating the new aspirational middle class, where the opportunities in a caste-based society, where the traditional dictates the opportunities for people, from there to a market-based opportunities, which provided that scope for transition for the society. Those are all incomplete processes. Nevertheless, it sets certain trajectories and people see a certain validity in that process. And I think that's the transformation which comes, and that then consolidates more about what Ravinder talked about, the kind of India that could be projected, and that had a domestic base, which is very much part of that. It's not simply the elite projecting it, but the lower middle class who have now seen certain kind of change in the standard of living would then be party to this. Along with that, obviously, the physically India changed. The kind of cities that we had, our infrastructure, etc., that we looked different. India looked different. And so I think the main part of that starts from the UPA 1 period, after the India Shining project was over, because that was the time when what India's potentials are, what India can do, globally that has been established. India had to make the strategic choices about finding the growth path, because so far the growth, as Professor Nagaraj's work shows us, that India basically the growth came from the service sector, where various forms, whether it's a mobile operator or somebody offering plumbing services, to all kind of things were taken into consideration, where the growth was. So you had an inflated service sector, and that then led to disbalance within the economic structure, because India's idea of manufacturing and finding a sustainable path through which it can transform the livelihood of people and increase the per capita, that never happened. And I think from the UPA one, that was the waking up call that you cannot simply go with the projections of certain kind of image, because that while it has an ideological acceptance within this emerging middle class, quote unquote middle class, because Indian middle class globally compared is basically a lower middle class, because it doesn't have that much of purchasing power as compared to the global or the Western middle class. But the strategic choices had to be made, and those were, what are those sectors where one can find growth? And what the choice that it made from there was to go and look into the primary commodity sectors, into the energy, and which are also big ticket investment. And it allowed, and what Kalyan Shanal and Partha talks about is a new framework where you can have primitive accumulation and the reversal of that, so that you bring certain kind of redistribution within it. And through that, you contain this force, the force which has been unleashed, and the state violence which was required. So at one hand, there was this conflict all over India around land acquisition and eviction and disposition. And on the other hand, you have rights-based approach, co-option of the civil society through the formation of National Advisory Council. And we saw a certain kind of a compact emerging in India at that time. And it seemed that that was the way to go. And unfortunately, then, of course, and then we saw the NREGAs and the direct benefit transfers and the use of technology into and gaining certain, an emphasis on gaining the state capacity, developing the state capacity through the technology, and very deep faith in technology, helping us to leapfrog various kind of bottlenecks that might exist, the various kind of capacities that might, the capacity bottlenecks and deficiencies that exist within the bureaucracy that can be leapfrogged within that new kind of and technological architecture in which the citizens will interact with the state. And what happened at that point is the 2008 financial crisis. Of course, that then completely took away the steam from this change which was happening. And I think that's where Modi, when he comes, both Modi 1 and 2 becomes extremely interesting here. Because what we find,
I would request you to just sort of, condense your comments, and we can just.
Yeah, do we have 5 minutes?
Sufficient time, sure. Sufficient time for Dr. Kaur and Dr. Gudavarthy to come in as well.
Okay, so what I find interesting about the Modi's regime is a certain this bringing the technocratic imagination within the electoral form, where the governance and how this no-nonsense politics, where when the government is formed, is going to bring an acceleration into the development. And that, I think, was very interesting, because for the first time you had all of that coming back into the politics again. But where it got perhaps distracted in the first year is the quest for a new legacy for Mr. Modi to bring and to displace the Nehruvian or Congress legacy and build himself. And there we saw much more emphasis on headline management and narrative management over any kind of data-driven approach. And the idea that this is a government without failure. It's a failure-proof government. And therefore, I think that distorted the feedback mechanism which was required there. And what Modi 2 brought in, I think, was a much more structured approach to this process. We, for the first time, have seen this national infrastructure pipeline, which is another way of acknowledging that 5-year planning was required in India, and the growth is going to come from the infrastructural investment. And the other is the formalization, which started with the demonetization and continued after the lockdown effect of the COVID, that the formalization will happen. And the informal economy will gradually shrink, and that most of it will shift to the formal sector. Now that obviously—
May I request you to please sort of, so we have sufficient time for also participant questions and respondent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, then maybe I can stop, and if required.
Yeah, we can come back to you. We can come back to you after Dr. Kaur has a chance to reflect on your preliminary comments so far. So may I now invite, thank you so much for, again, that very detailed sort of unpacking of the kind of publics that were formed before, as we were leading up to the India Shining campaign and the creation of the brand new nation. I would now like to invite Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy to share his comments.
Okay, thanks, Priyadarshini. So, congrats to Ravinder for the book. The way I really read this book, parts of your introduction, Ravinder, was, I think at a theoretical plane, it addresses the question that much of contemporary political theory, especially critical theory, is kind of addressing that interface between economy and culture. That there is a cultural and an emotive framing of economy, and there are no bare economic interests. And this has been a question, I teach a whole course on critical theory and we deal. And now your book is a good instance to give as a reading to show what it concretely means, that how effective dimensions can actually concretely, and that economy itself is at one level not merely material, but it's actually a part of imagination. Cultural sociologist Jeffrey Alexander, in his book on trauma, makes this point that globalization was a response to the trauma of Cold War. That the reason why we went in for this kind of a exaggerated, image of globalization and its outcomes was partly out of the trauma of Cold War, and therefore he argues that neoliberalism, neoliberal globalization itself is some kind of a new imagination. So that, I think, is the core relevance. I see how one could approach your work. But I had few questions and few ways of kind of whether we could think of reframing in a larger context, that because at the heart of your argument is a certain kind of marketization of nation and marketization of emotions that come along with nation, as you cite, devotion, love, sacrifice, so on and so forth. The question that we could perhaps begin with is, why have markets gained this kind of centrality in the global spatial imagination? Why do you think other social processes? I mean, this has been an old question, right, from Adam Smith onward, from between markets and moral sentiments and the tension that arises. But here we are in a new context where I think markets have gained a certain kind of a centrality. And one clue that I pick up is from Michael Sandel's work, on what markets cannot buy, where he says that one of the things that markets do is that they don't judge. They're not judgmental in the kind of value allocation that they do. That it's market exchange are based on exchange relations. And therefore, I think, would you agree, if one were to argue that, even as one goes along with your work and with your critique, but there could be a kind of, I'm following your footsteps and doing a counterintuitive reading of your book, as you suggest, a counterintuitive reading, that, that the centrality of market, while we would all critique, but I think has a larger social and an ethical crisis that has also pushed this kind of centrality. Therefore, mere critique perhaps has to be accompanied by this larger theoretical, political, global context that I see, this shift that you suggest from citizen to consumer, that, that shift has been accompanied by shift from, in Europe, from secularism to multiculturalism, which kind of failed, which kind of turned out to be a failed policy to accommodate differences. It is also accompanied by the entire shift to relativism, to a certain kind of ethical crisis that we know, that evaluative process itself has kind of become difficult, in terms of social dynamics. Therefore, my question to you would be that does this marketization of nation actually accompany a certain kind of relativist, ethical, global crisis, that where market and capital are the only universalizing and only unifying kind of systems that have globally emerged, that it is accompanied by a massive social fragmentation, and we are unable to politically and ethically cope with that kind of a massive social fragmentation. I think this comes out very clearly in David Harvey's work on compensatory consumption, where he says capitalism offers that compensatory consumption as in lieu of questions of dignity, equality, and other ethical and socially relevant questions. So while I go along with your critique of marketization of nations, but I'm only trying to understand if we can kind of reframe it in this larger crisis that it seems to be accompanying, then perhaps we might want to approach that critique of market at a different plane. I mean, maybe we need to raise a different set of questions to kind of argue why emotions. So therefore, even in terms of that emotions that you appeal, that kind of foreground, if one way to make a deeper review, would you agree that while there is a certain kind of marketization, a mounting of the emotive and affective dimension that is clearly visible in populism, but there is also a certain kind of an emptying of those emotions. That if you look at the imageries of Modi and other populist authoritarian figures, that they emote without the vulnerabilities that accompany emotions. Zizek makes this very interesting point on the fear of falling in love. He says that modernity kind of foregrounded the unpredictability that encounters of love demand. Therefore, he gives this very interesting instance of dating services where you match everything and only then you decide to fall in love. So it's an afterthought rather than that unpredictable encounter that, he says that's the fear of fall, that fear of fall, which is also very neoliberal in, even etymological, that fear of fall is part of the neoliberal language. Therefore, I think this emotion, if that you kind of very rightly foregrounded, can we also read that this branding of nation, while it is emotive, it also is accompanying a certain kind of emptying of those vulnerabilities that accompany emotions, which are also linked to both market and populist authoritarianism. And what would that mean for us now? What kind of critique then can we really offer of markets? It's not merely about displacing emotions, but something more that seems to be happening. Similarly, I pick on your point. You make a very interesting point on anti-politics, in course of your introduction. I think that's a very important, that on one hand is this projecting of nation as a commodification of nation, but you also say that it is something that cannot be commodified. So it kind of breaches that secular, sacred, profane kind of a thing. And similarly, this anti-politics is, I think, also at the heart of this question, that this marketization is also like, one is ethical, second, I think, is the crisis of the politics, of the framing of political interests. I think is the second, at second level, I found that this whole business of professional experts that we keep bringing in. Now you have Prashant Kishore, who is also a political analyst, a political aide, is now, we are all turning to him to save us from this populist authoritarian. Today is the business of anti-politics, which brought in that language what you suggest, maximum governance and minimum government. And if you go back in 90s, it was Chandrababu Naidu in Telangana who was first, for instance, he called himself a CEO and he said, I'm not a chief minister, but I'm a CEO. And this language, now we have Shanghai, Singapore, even Mr. Yogi Adityanath is talking about Singapore and Shanghai, and this continuous imageries that keep flowing, I think some of which you have shown. So I'm also wondering, where does this, if this anti-political framing has some deeper cultural codes in the Indian context. Our post-colonial history has always been suspicious of modernity, and that was kind of also accompanied our kind of a suspect relation with politics as a modern, our suspicion of modern institutions, our suspicion of modern statecraft. If you look at the RSS discourse, they invariably call themselves a cultural organization, not a political one. So I think this has been a pretty old, though neoliberalism kind of foregrounded it, this has been a pretty old, this political, non-political, political, anti-politics kind of a tension has been a pretty old, and it somewhere relates to a deeper cultural codes in India. That there is so while we within the modernist critical analysis might be suspicious of this anti-politics business, but there is something deeper that that allows populism. So while Lucknow calls populism is quintessentially political, but in Indian populism engages primarily an anti-political discourse, that everything they do is anti-political. It's either national, it's either religious, it is ethical, it is spiritual, anything but political. So how would you, kind of, in Pratima Banerjee's recent book on political, non-political, she tries to draw our attention to some of these deeper kind of issues. So if one way to argue that this anti-politics is not something new that emerged with neoliberalism, while much of work, Lesotho of the project of that book on anti-political machine No, we have been reading this literature for the last 2 or 3 decades, but in Indian case, there seems to be something deeply suspicious of the modern statecraft and politics, which can be good, which can be something that can have other kind of potentialities. So that was my second question, that if we were to think in this larger context, how could we kind of think of this anti-politics as not something specific to this branding of nation, but something that has a larger history to it and maybe deeper cultural codes. Priyadarshini, how many minutes I have? I have to rush.
Yes, no, that's a very rich set of reflections and comments.
I want to just make one last.
Sure, please.
Quick, it's about the sociological grounding of the Ravinder's arguments. I think because Ravinder's book does present the rich material, I think there can be more exploration of more than what has been presented. The other question is, if you'd be interested in looking at the caste question, I think very closely aligns with this marketization. That the new kinds of hope that it has created, in terms of addressing, especially the OBC mobility from Mofusils to cities, the rural migration to urban, anonymity that urban spaces bring to caste-based questions. So I think there is again there's a link that I see in terms of why this kind of new marketization kind of eclipses and moves along with especially, I mean, we can take Muslim and many other, but if you stick to this Dalit Bahujan, caste-based aspirations, you can see, for instance, they're demanding English as a medium of education. I mean, they're not demanding common school, but their emphasis on English as a means of mobility to overcome everyday humiliation, which kind of aligns with a global language, its status as a global language. And in India, English, as Prana Bardhan pointed out, made middle class kind of a elite class, primarily because the scarcity, English as a commodity. So I think if you even look at the sociological point of view in terms of what it is doing to social hierarchies, whether it completely transforms them or not, but the fact that it creates this hope, I think then we'll have to perhaps make an entry point which might be different in order that our critical analysis does not align with what you call the elite. Now I have 2 points, but I think Priyadarshini is getting restless, so I'll stop here.
No, thank you so much for that extremely useful interventions, both from Professor Sarkar and Dr. Gudavarthy. I would not want to elaborate on that. I will get straight to the matter and request Ravinder to come and share with us her response to this.
Okay, I have to say thank you so much both to Swagoto and Ajay, and I think maybe I can just collapse both responses. Huh? I think Swagoto has been speaking about failures, and which I will come to, but I think I'll begin by what Ajay has pointed out, namely, what is the bigger theoretical story unfolding here vis-a-vis the critique of market or, capitalism. So first of all, I think I would say that nothing, as we know, nothing is set in stone ever. What we are witnessing is a mere moment which may change. And this is something tremendously important to bear in mind, because I think what, the literature that you have mentioned in terms of, what money can buy, or the value, or the whole literature, which comes out on capitalism. One thing that I'm extremely mindful of is that 100 years ago, recall that the hope of the world was fixated on socialism as a solution, because there is so much literature which is produced on, Soviet Union. The Soviet Revolution unleashed literally an alternate world, which could also be produced through socialist structures, right? So, and this is not just, the Soviet example, it travels around the world as well. But 100 years later, or actually, 3/4 of a century later, what we witnessed was that moment we were told this experiment has failed, it has gone. I mean, human history is filled with these kind of, transitions which continue to take place. Nothing is set in stone. I again maintain that, because we already, even at this stage, where what I'm offering, as a proposition that the capitalist logic of economic growth has seeped through the politics of the nation. And actually in early 2000s, Yamini had a very good point. This whole reimagination of who's an Indian, who are we, and what do we represent, our everything was being celebrated at that time, including the fact that we can withstand adversity is a fact. We don't, we in the morning, get up in the morning and collect water in the buckets. I mean, and anyone who has lived in Basant Kuj in early 2000s would recall that, right? So now the thing is that adversity makes us stronger people, innovative people. I have a whole paper which is separately written on that. Now the thing here is that, yes, indeed, capitalism in India in the, in that turn of the century did become something which is so deeply ingrained. And what is the most amazing part is that even the communist ruled states, and in this case, Bengal also has a branding program, by the way, which wants to bring in, investments, which is a different story, which was unfolding, from the Singur protest, just in 2008. Nothing is certain. And why I repeat that? Because already at this moment, we see that there are massive protests, massive money. Farmers' protest is very important in this respect, because this has been long sustained. It has continued. There are, of course, there are many variations. I mean, there are many critiques of how farming should be. And putting that question aside, of course, we can always have better, efficient, more productive, more ecological friendly, etc. farming methods. That's not the point. The point is that even in that, the whole notion that every sector of the Indian economy is going to be open to private players is being contested. Likewise, the labor code, which was created also last year, which tampered with the laws, the trade unionism, etc. I mean, what is amazing about the farmers' movement is that it also brought together, it continued to build bridges, alliances with these different aspects, the so-called factors of production. So the point here is that I do not look upon much of it in pessimistic ways, because there is inherent pessimism in the literature that you mentioned, that money can, what can money buy? So what I'm showing in this book, and you're so right, Ajay, thank you so much for pointing this out, the anti-politics, the people that have been working in, because this is an ethnography also of, the people who, I often think about Ram Guha's book, Makers of Modern India. So when he writes, puts together this book, it has all politicians, right? Political leaders. But, when I said about writing, I could not see many politicians involved in this. And I have never approached politicians for interviews. It was literally the bureaucrats. These are the policy makers, people who run ad agencies, people who actually draw the nation for us, right? So this is a different kind of setup. And here, this is where we witness the tensions too. That we want to set out selling something which we inherently think is unsaleable, in the sense it's above selling, it's above market. And this is amazing when you witness, when how India is represented. It is in those, modes of marketization that you see the failure of that project as well. So what I mean to say is that this is not cut and dry. This is not straightforward. This is a heavy negotiation of politics which is going on, where the nation is drawn and redrawn. The way I look upon capital and culture is that these are fuels. You can put them and redraw the nation in a different way, which could also be a source of optimism. It need not be like this, because the reason I showed you some pictures, of the Muslim entrepreneur, how many pictures, you would not today, when we especially witness what is happening in Uttar Pradesh regarding economic boycotts, etc., you would not think about that. But the thing is, yes, there were some people who were attempting to think like this too. So we should not rule that out. Priyadarshini, finally, to Swagoto, I think he's rightly pointed out, the many twists and turns in the story of liberalization which took place, and especially that how the entire premise of the Modi government literally has been that failure is not an option. Now, the thing is that if the whole politics is built upon from celebrating, celebration is the mainstay, then how do you even encounter things like the pandemic? And this is where I think pandemic moment has been so important, because here we see all the problematic frictions arising in this scheme of things, where things were falling apart, but at the same time, we were told to be positive. And this is why we should not be surprised at how imagery of all the things became a major battleground. And recall that we are on in lockdown. We are locked down. Only thing we have in front of us is a screen. What we witness the world through images. So images have been the battleground of politics. And the kind of politics where we continue to be positive. There is no room for criticism, and criticism itself is seen as an act of treachery, right? Which is something which does not gel with the very democratic structures of the nation. So I think maybe I would say that this is not a done story. This is still unfolding, and what you have to look upon is that how contestations continue to take place. And interestingly, it is not political parties, main political parties, which are forging this contestation. It is actually coming from altogether different unexpected quarters, like this groundswell of movements which are taking place.
Okay, thank you so much, Ravinder. I will just come to you, Professor Sarkar. Just in the interest of time, and also to sort of also get in comments from Yamini and Mekhala. Mekhala, would you like to come in on some of your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ravinder, for that presentation, and to Swagoto and Ajay for really provocative, I think both important contextualization and provocative questions for us, thinking about the theoretical implications of your book. So I'll be very brief, and I'm sure maybe our audience will also have questions that they will want to pose while we have a little opportunity to exchange. So here, I was thinking very much what you said about hope. It's interesting, or optimism, right? The possibility that structures could change again. I mean, at the State Capacity Initiative, we often talk about how to be not naive, but hopeful about some of this, right? So how do we retain our hope, but not be naive? It's not easy, but that, is an important point, I think, that you make here, and talking about the movements in that context. But for this reason, I wanted to go back to your very important point about not just looking at material culture as propaganda, right? And taking it seriously as data, but also understanding the various work that it does. And here I was just struck, because there's an archive of that earlier India too, which engaged a lot with material cultures. And so I was thinking, in my work on markets, I've actually looked at some of these old films division films on why regulated markets matter. I'll send you a copy of it. It's a very emotive film about, and films division actually put an archive of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a very different state, a very different nation, but also using images. Using the medium, both of images and of short films and public service announcements and others. And part of what we've also been thinking about is how to engage with this world of image production as central to how the state thinks of its responsibilities, right? So this shift from a state which thought of itself as a regulator, as a creator of public markets, and spoke of that role visually, right? Why a state regulated Mandi is so important today, to becoming the generator of brand India, right? And I'm thinking of IBEF, which you talk about, India Brand Equity Foundation, and having to produce this kind of different communication material, right? So what is the possibility of then thinking about this, the state and its roles, right, differently? Because obviously it's not that the material culture is new. State has always had a material life, but something has happened in the way we mobilize. And then what is the scope, therefore, of returning, or even not returning, but renewing certain commitments to public goods even the market as a space for public good and engagement, rather than this aspirational, that was the moment. And is that only a socialist imagination then? Because anytime we make these statements today, it ends up being like, but that's socialist India, right? So we can't go back there. So what are the possibilities of this alternative and how does one think about it? Linking just to the IBEF, I was very curious about the institutional life that manufactures the state and this kind of brand, right, of the nation. So there are certain institutions, you mentioned the bureaucrats and the ad agencies and the professionals, but I'm curious also about the actual institutions, right? Like I mentioned FTI, film division is a very different kind of institution than the IBEF, right? So are these new forms? Do they come onto the landscape for the first time? And what does it mean that the Indian state, the ministries, the funds, the foundations are becoming? I mean, in that context, even PM Cares is interesting. It's a very new kind of institution. We haven't had that kind of fund before. So, just a small reflection on the institutional landscape that has produced this. And then finally, actually, it sort of in a way links up also to Swagoto's question, mapping of this period. This is also a time in, the Modi project, particularly of this government, of the nation particularly being marshaled as a one nation, one everything, as people say, right? So there's one nation, one market very much in the case of agricultural market, one nation, one tax, one nation, one ration card, one, so this idea is also a different way in which, and it's a domestic battle and it's highly contested. It challenges, it's federally challenging as well because the states get bypassed in the story in a certain way, and there's a certain relationship that is being built up between the state, the nation, and the citizen. Also, this one nation work, right? And the actual institutions of cooperative federalism are actually remarkably weak for this challenge as well. So I was just, so this is the third place in where the nation particularly as a form is being contested and attempted to be crafted in a certain way, institutionally and in policy and politics. So these were some thoughts that were on my mind.
Great. Thank you, Mekhala. Yamini.
Well, I don't want to take away time from the Q&A, but I just very quickly say two things. I think one of the things that struck me when listening to your presentation and looking at the images, I thought back to the mid-1980s when the state was playing a very crucial role in creating imagery about the nation around one of our landmark Independence Days, and Doordarshan was producing this whole host of small, I grew up watching those with avid attention. And a lot of that actually was celebrating the public sector and celebrating icons of India who were from sports, who were from music, who were from Bollywood. And then you contrast that with the images that you presented. They are much sleeker. They are much more, they're catchier. And, the ad agency that built that Incredible India campaign is, quite iconic of sort of the making of multiple brands that together make up Brand India, and Incredible India was one of those. But the people that we are celebrating in those are the Indian capitalists. And, juxtaposed to what you were saying about the politician somewhere being a little bit more behind, in the backdrop of this, and the bureaucrat being front and center. A lot of, I was also thinking back to many conversations that we've been having as part of our state capacity work too, about how the public and looks to the state. And, the moment of liberalization also coincides with a broad public disenchantment with the capabilities of the state, and constantly looking to the private in the hope that the private will be able to do even some of the very basic things that the state does. And all of us as elites in our everyday life even privatize our security. Now we privatize our air, pure public goods, forget health and education, all out of a sort of disenchantment. It came from from this, the bureaucrats themselves, I think, have played a very important role, even though private capital in India still today says it's a bureaucrat that is anti-capitalist. Actually, the bureaucrat in many ways has tried very hard to shift their image, and their aspirations are actually very distinct, distance from the state. Their aspirations are very much firmly in the world and imagination of private capital. And then it's brought me to a third sort of completely different thread. But years ago, a few years ago, I remember reading a blog that was written by an IAS officer who moved from being a district magistrate to an undersecretary in the state government and started complaining about his fellow peers who were in the private sector, who could take their wives to there's some fancy lake resort in Kumarakam in Kerala, which is a 5-star hotel and really out of the league for paying for anybody who's in government. And why should I not be given these chances? I mean, how we, as the brand India was being built, as a collective identity formation of India in this imagination of what markets can give us and global positions we can take, it also, alongside with this, moved the imagination and aspirations of those that make up the state and where they wanted to place themselves. So the makers of modern India are very different to the makers of liberal India, because we actually aspire to be capital, even though we don't like many things about, there is a deep suspicion between bureaucracy and capital. But that aspiration is very strong. And to me, that really struck me as I was just, because you presented all your images together, the imagery really hit home in ways. And I think a lot of what you're, what we're learning from the conversation too is how much that imagery is shaping the sort of relationships across different actors and stakeholders of the state and of society, into what is going to be where we are currently. Even today, the lost aspirations of young India are also aspirations that are linked to an imagined culture of this brand that keeps presenting itself to us. So when I see that little brand India, Air India advertisement about Delhi, even if I've just gone for 3 days and I see that ad, it makes me yearn for my home in a way that, but it makes me yearn for that home, that clean, beautiful, pure home, not the chaos that is the real world that we live in. What that does to the aspiring middle classes and how the future of India is going to be shaped, I think is a big question mark.
Great. Thank you so much for those comments, Mekhala and Yamini. I'm just going to take one of the audience questions here and add one very, very tiny question from my end, but we can continue this conversation in depth later. The question that we have from the audience here is that how does the book Identity Economy look at crony capitalism, where the capital and culture nexus, and where is the capital and culture nexus in neoliberal era, especially capitalist forces and political Hindus? And my question is, where does social media and the kind of public that social media platforms create fit into the creation of brand India? I mean, this is your Twitter handles and your Facebook communities create very different sorts of publics than the people and the sovereign space that elects representatives. So I don't know to what extent in your research you found that the audience for the propaganda and the publicity was also these publics, if at all they were, and if they were not, this audience is sort of ever present and has become more and more important from late 2000s onwards, and was particularly important in 2014 national elections. So what is the relationship between this sort of public and the reception of the brand India imagery that was created from 2003 onwards? And what if we didn't have this public? What if there was no social media? Would that have put certain sorts of limits to what the national identity that brand India projects would have meant? I'll give you a chance to respond, and after that we can get quick comments from Professor Sarkar and Dr. Gudavarthy, and then we'll come to the end of the session. So Ravinder, over to you.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'll make it short because there's so much we can talk about. So I think I'll just first of all, I think Mekhala, thank you so much. You mentioned about, I think maybe I'll focus on IBEF you're talking about, huh? I mean, and you're so right that Sri Rupa Roy has this fantastic book, on the stuff that you're talking about, huh? And she's, of course, looking at film division. And I would love to have the documentary that you're talking about. I think what I'm focusing on this a different type of organization, which is part of the structural adjustment program, but often overlooked. Because everyone, when they think about economic transformation, they are thinking about certain regulations, changes in laws, pertaining to trade barriers, et cetera, All that story is very well known. But hidden in that is a little piece, namely that already in mid-1990s, the government decided, government of India decided to, focus on building India's image. And in that case, it was about building made in India export, to boost India's exports. So successively, as I have actually sources in that in the book, in the footnotes, it was overlooked, but I think in the late 1990s, the organization was once again remade. It became more formalized, a partnership between Confederation of Indian Industries and the Ministry of Commerce. And that kind of relationship has continued changing up and down, depending on which government is in office and which bureaucrat is running the whole show. And but nevertheless, this partnership continues. And IBEF has a very specific kind of I'm also showing how their goals have continued to change, how they actually from exports, they come not to goods, but to India as a good, India as a product which can be sold. And their basic work is, of course, this glossy, brochures which have been produced. There are videos, there are loads of things, which actually I could not put everything in that book. There's lots of material. And then, of course, what they do is to put up major spectacles abroad. This is where I think you cannot think about India within its national territory. Like you cannot think how India is being produced, reimagined only within that territory, because a lot of it is being done elsewhere. It is happening in places like New York, in Berlin, in Davos, in London. I mean, these kind of mega campaigns, shows. By the way, we are heading towards 75th anniversary of India's independence. I can assure you, from now on, all the major programs have already started, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, right? So, I mean, under that aegis, you will be seeing loads of stuff that I'm talking about. So IBEF is promoting pharmaceutical industry. So they have these different sectors that they promote. So I think this is the overall structure of that. And there's one small thing I want to say. I tend to use the term capitalism instead of market, because market somehow gives us this notion of economy as if it's an equal, level field where we are just happily doing barter with each other, exchanging stuff. It looks like a very happy, romantic place, right? But I think we have, especially during the globalization discourse, we sort of stopped talking about capitalism when it is literally the processes of capitalism we were talking happening. But globalization sounded so nice, like it's this networked, world, right? Everyone flat world that we were talking about. So I think this is where I would say that if we confront the beast as it is, then it also allows us to assess what is happening and also to see the kind of tensions, contestations, and, this is Gramsci who talked about. I mean, we can be pessimistic. We don't need to be naive, but read the landscape carefully. And what do you see? That this is not something which is a preordained kind of project, because it is right now as we speak, it is being contested. So the thing is that there is, of course, it's not like we are going to make predictions of what is going to happen, but the state capital relationship, maybe, and this includes, I think, Yamini's, remarks as well, which is, I think, state-capital relations. I think there is so much confusion about it. There is so much confusion as to what does Modi government represent at this moment. Because on one hand, you have this Atmanirbhar Bharat. On the other hand, you have monetization plan. And of course, not to forget demonetization, which took place, right? So I think according to the theoretical literature that we are familiar with about state-capital relations, we are used to certain kind of models, right? Visible hand, invisible hand, and so on and so forth. But what do we witness here? Which is that it is literally the pact between the state and capital, but it is not that free market pact. And this is where a very strong state has emerged. But unlike the neoliberal literature, which presumes the demise of the state, where the true freedoms would rule, this is not what is happening. We all know that, right? So literally, a new kind of dynamic has been settled between the state and capital, in which state is the one which is not going to die, because it is also going to be the defender, in this case, a promoter of this cultural nationalism, a specific brand of what India should be, right? So I think, which connects to another question which was posed about crony capitalism. There is nothing called crony capitalism, because some people would say, because crony capitalism presumes that there is a purer form of capitalism, namely where everything is happening by the book, a very legal sort of market operation is taking place, and crony is simply some sort of impurity, corrosion, which has entered into it, right? But we do know how accumulation takes place. And it is that accumulation, if we begin focusing on that, then what we witness is the making of a very strong capitalist entity where state itself is a strong actor. And actually it is more the Chinese model. It is not the public sector, that literature that we are familiar with from 1950s, 60s, 70s. When we think about state capitalism, we immediately start thinking of that. No, I think this is where the confusion needs to be resolved. We need to theorize afresh that what kind of pact between state and capital that we are witnessing here, where you can speak about Atmanirbhar Bharat, and for God's sake, everyone starts thinking about Swadeshi, right? But Atmanirbhar Bharat is literally saying, please come and manufacture here. We are making for the world. It's a totally different kind of model. So I think this is where I resist usually using terminologies, also including neoliberalism, which comes with a very cut and dry framework that we sort of either apply or contest. What I'm saying is what India is, this is where I find India so fascinating as like what is happening here. It allows us to think afresh of all these different kind of contestations, and consolidation, and once again, it's I would say also fragilities in the project of global capitalism.
I'm muted. Sorry, yeah. Thank you so much, Ravinder. I know we have woefully run out of time, and I would have loved to give an opportunity to Professor Sarkar and Dr. Gudavarthy to come in with last comments, but I think very quickly, just a minute or so. Professor Sarkar, do you have something to add?
No, I think all that I wanted to say is that, what we have seen, if one looks through the failures of the various projects that the nationalists have, the framing has created in the project, and including the NIP and the monetization plan, if you read it, it's written all over that is going to fail. I'm not going to take much time. The NIP is going to have, 111 lakh crore, and the monetization pipeline is bringing only 5% of that. So, and the institutional capacities are not there, the fundamentals are not there. If you look into National Investment Grid website, which has both NIP and non-NIP projects, the NIP projects there's a lot of confusion about what is investment and what is expenditure. IIT Delhi's boys hostel is part of the NIP. So that we are not looking at the fundamentals. So we can keep reading into the images, but the fundamentals, I think we are slightly, another 10, 20 years from now, we will have certain kind of a crisis, which I think the kind of nationalism that we're going to see are going to change completely. And we need, what I was trying to do in mapping it, to give a rear view mirror into it and try to see that what are the problems that are building up and which cannot be resolved through any kind of, simply appeal to the market, as Ajay was pointing to. The kind of social pathologies cannot be resolved through this kind of process.
Sure, thank you so much. Dr. Gudavarthy, any closing comments?
Yeah, no, I was reminded of an event I was part of in Chennai, CIA, that was hosted by Confederation of Indian Industries, and my co-panelists, or one who was sharing, was Mr. Naushad Forbes, and he gave a very long talk on social justice, on affirmative action, and he suggested alternative means, of how to marketize handicrafts, tribal products, and we had some tribals coming from all the way. They brought them and they were demonstrating their honey and the extraction process, and so I was skeptical that what this all this means. Now, as Ravinder says, we'll have to make new sense. The only concrete part was they hosted us in Taj in Chennai. That was the only good part of that show, I thought. But now Ravinder is asking us, we might have to think that these strategies, what do they actually mean for nation and nation state, I think is what she's opening up.
Thank you so much. I just would just like to thank everybody on the panel, particularly our presenter, Ravinder. It's been a very fascinating discussion that has literally traversed all sorts of registers, the social media, the global capitalist order, and different sorts of materials. And I would just like to end this discussion on a point that multiple discussants over here have alluded to, that alongside all the fragilities of the capitalist project, there are also important structural factors that are important to keep in mind. But along with the pessimism, there's also a optimistic note that we must look forward to, for there are always contestations and there are always contradictions within any kind of large majoritarian project. So thank you so much, and we will continue this conversation onwards going forward. Thanks so much.
Okay.
And thank you so much, Priyadarshini.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Priyadarshini.
Thanks.
Hope to see all of you again soon.
Yes. And thanks to CPR.
Yes. Hopefully we'll have you in person here one of these days. Yeah. Great.